I'm going to talk about research in low-income settings, and I'm going to put that into context with my own experience of doing research in these settings, and also talk a little bit more widely about when to do research, how you should go about developing a research question, and how you should go about planning to do research in a low or middle-income country. So let's first look at when to do research. If you look at my career path, I'm atypical when it comes to research in that I didn't get involved in research until much later on in my career. The first research project I undertook was as an ST6 equivalent when I was in Uganda, and I did a PhD between my ST7 and ST8 year. And up until my first research project, I didn't leave university with a BSc or any other degree. And the reason why I've put this up here is just to highlight the fact that there's no set way to do research in paediatrics. And indeed, I would broaden that and say that in any field of medicine, research is accessible at almost every level. And to remove some misconceptions off the bat, whilst you can do research at any point in your career, it's also important to recognise that prior experience of research is not a requirement to get involved in a research project. Certainly, the more experience you have, can help you to develop different roles and take on different responsibilities. But you've always got to start from somewhere. And having no research experience shouldn't preclude you from getting involved in a project, either in this country or abroad. Also, something that's come up quite regularly when I talk to fellow trainees and also fellow researchers is that people worry that having a family might be a barrier to doing research. You know, what should I do if I want to have a child in the middle of a PhD? What should I do if a family circumstance changes during research? And these things are not insurmountable barriers. I can't lie to you and say that it doesn't require a bit of out of the box thinking to overcome some of these things, but actually most supervisors that I've met and most departments that I've worked with and worked in are very keyed up to the fact that that we need to offer opportunities to research no matter what your family circumstances are, and that we need to involve people from a wide range of situations in order to make the research better. So it's not that you are creating problems for us. We welcome people with families, without families, with different family backgrounds, and we welcome people because the more broad our research team, the better the research is going to be. So please don't be put off by that. And the last thing, and for me this was my personal barrier to research, was that I never felt that I had a very clear question that I wanted to answer, or a very clear idea of what a research project looked like and how it should be designed. And I think that this is not something that you have to have clear in your mind when you start looking at doing research. And if we take that a little bit further and look at how you develop your research question, as you change in your career and you progress from F1 to being a specialist trainee and then on to being a consultant and even a professor, the way that you approach research changes. And I've put these lining up, but actually the pathway on the right of the screen is not set to being an F1 and a professor. You might reach different points on this ladder at different times in your career, but most people start off by thinking that actually you're interested in research and you want to make a difference and to make a change. and that's fine, and that's a really valid way to start approaching research. And at that point, if that's what you're thinking, talk to people who are involved in research, be they PIs or high up professors, or even just colleagues that you know who also have a research interest. And then we can help signpost you to projects that might be ongoing, and where you can help answer someone else's question, where the research methodology that you learn from that becomes a platform for you answering your own questions. And then what the aim is that once you've answered these, started answering questions, that you need someone to pull all of that together and put the answers into the bigger picture, into context with other research, and also research from other people. And I think that it's very rare, in my experience, that you start off understanding the whole field that you're interested in, and being able to direct your questions appropriately, etc., straight off the bat. And so there's a progression in research, and I think that's often lost, particularly in the developing world, where people want to go out, make a change, and save the world. And this is certainly much harder to do in the developing world than it is to do in this country. And I would argue that when you do research in low-income settings, it requires even more experience and even more supervision than when you do it in this country. So when you're looking at developing your own question, or what question you want to be involved with answering, the first thing to do is to talk to people who are involved in your field of interest. So I'm a neonatologist. So when I first thought, right, I want to do some research, I talked to the people in my department who were interested in research, and I was signposted to those people by my educational supervisor. It helped hugely that I had worked in the field of neonatology. But when I did my research in Uganda, which I'll talk about in a little bit, it helped hugely that I had worked for many years in Uganda before I did my research project there. I think it's really important to acknowledge that, as well as answering questions and getting peer-reviewed journals, etc., etc., the most important reason why we do research is to make life better for the patients and their parents that we care for. And the only way to be sure that you are making life better for your patients and parents is to talk to them and to find out what would make their lives better, what would help them deal with what they are struggling with, and then form your ideas and questions around the patient. And I think that Chris Gale from Chelsea has done some amazing work on this recently. And if you're going to read one journal article after this talk, his recent paper discussing the patient's perspective on research is certainly an article to read. The next thing is to read about some of the research that's been done in your field. There's nothing worse than coming up with the most amazing research idea and question, and then finding out that someone's already answered it 4 years ago, or finding out that someone's tried it and it doesn't work. So don't try and reinvent the wheel. Find out what's been done in your field and try and work out what's still needed to be done. And then the last thing is to talk to people who are researching in the same area that you want to work in. And this is because, in my experience, no two research projects are the same, and no two research departments are the same. Every department, every research project has things that are incredibly exciting and incredibly useful and helpful, but also there are their own challenges that need to be overcome or accepted and worked around. And the only way of knowing truly what your research career is going to be like, or your research post might be like, is to talk to people who are doing it. And these are things that we as doctors, we are used to this pattern in terms of when we applied to medical school. Part of our medical school application was an understanding that what it was like to be a doctor, and part of our specialty training application was to talk to people who are paediatricians and experience that. And research is really no different to those application processes that we're all used to being involved with. So when you're coming up with your question, you must make sure that your question is useful, it's relevant, it's of interest to the patients and the parents, and it's also of interest to other professionals. And this means that if you come up with a question that ticks all of these boxes, then it will be much easier for you to firstly engage other people in your research, to get collaboration to undertake your research project, funding if that's necessary as well, but also that your research will make a difference to the people that you're caring for. And that difference doesn't necessarily mean that you save more lives or that you reduce the number of days of admission, etc. It may be that you describe an area of physiology that we didn't understand before and now do. And I think that all of these things are important in creating your questions and are almost key points before you move on to undertaking a research project. So how do you plan your research project? Well, again, as is the way of research and indeed pediatrics, there is no blueprint where I can tell you, if you do this, you will have a successful research project. Across the world and across the history of time, there have been so many research projects, some done well, some done badly, but almost entirely all are different. There are some key points to remember, and I'll try and highlight those as we go through, like the key slide we saw earlier. But actually, there are many ways to perform research, and that different ways are more applicable to certain scenarios than others. But what I thought I would do is go through a research project that I undertook in Uganda, because actually the research project went quite well, and there's been lots of learning that I've had from this project, and I think it's quite helpful to share that. So just to give you a bit of background, I have worked in Uganda since 2002. And I first went as a medical student when I went there for 6 months, and then I visited the same hospital for a month at a time, almost every year up to about 2000 and 2012. And then in 2012, I lived at Kagando Hospital for a year as part of an out of program experience, and that was when I undertook this research project. The hospital that I worked in was originally a missionary hospital that was built for lepers in the middle of Uganda, or sorry, in the middle of Africa, in fact, as it was at the time. And then once it was established, it quickly became a focal point for medical care in the west of Uganda, and it is still the largest hospital for any direction, for about 4 hours in any direction, including into the Congo across the border. The hospital has got 8 wards, and one of those wards is a paediatric ward, and up to 200 patients are cared for on the paediatric ward. 50 of those can be neonatal patients who initially were cared for at the end of the paediatric ward at Kagando. There are 2 to 5 doctors for the whole hospital. Like I said, I'd visited the hospital for many years, and I'd undertaken a number of roles there, the majority of them service provision. So I would go for a month, and that would allow one of those, potentially 2 doctors, to go on annual leave for a month, and then it would give them a boost of energy to come back and carry on. The workload is intense. You work for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Sometimes you hand over the on-call to other people, And the kind of things that we would look after are patients with malaria, patients with HIV, patients with surgical problems, and also a large number of maternity patients who were having anything from normal deliveries to Siamese twins. So all of these factors led us to look at neonatal care. So over the 10 years that I visited prior to the research project, I had seen that our care of small babies was very, very difficult. And it was difficult because of lack of equipment and lack of knowledge in some ways. But the neonatal mortality in Uganda is incredibly high, that 44 babies of every 1,000 die in Uganda, and those first 28 days of life are the most dangerous 28 days of life when you look at the whole of someone's lifespan. And when you compare that to our neonatal mortality rate of about 2.5 in every 1,000, you can see that there was a significant problem. And this was very visible in the hospital because we saw that babies died every day. There were ward rounds that you would do, and I would see maybe 2 or 3 babies who died overnight, and it hadn't been recognized even that they died because they were buried in all the things that we had to wrap them in to keep them warm. Because we didn't have modern incubators and things like that. And kangaroo care is a different issue, which we can maybe touch on towards the end. And I knew from my experience working there that, as well as me being sad by this, that the hospital staff as well were desperate to stop these babies from dying. And it wasn't through lack of want or lack of caring that these babies were dying. It was a really difficult situation. And so this led me to think, well, why? What is the problem? Why are we experiencing such high mortality even within a hospital setting? Why is the mortality so high? And when you look at the neonatal unit, and this is a photo of the neonatal unit, and I've left it this dark because this was genuinely how dark it was. Now, anyone who's done any kind of neonatology knows how difficult it is to cannulate a baby when you've got a spotlight, a cold light, and 500 million other things to help you. But this was how dark it was in the end of the paediatric ward where the neonatal unit was situated. We had 20 to 50 babies within this space. In this current photo, there's 23 babies. There's one nurse on duty per shift, and there's anywhere between 0 and 3 nursing students. There's one doctor whose job it was to do the neonatal ward round, but they also had to cover the general paediatric ward, which had another 150 very sick patients, and also occasionally the adult medical ward as well. There's no unit or national policies, or there were no unit or national policies at the time, and so the variation in care was quite wide, and everyone was quite sad. I cannot tell you how sad it is when you come to work knowing that you're going to see a baby die that day. It sounds obvious, but I wasn't quite prepared for seeing that day in, day out in my time in Uganda. And on the face of it, you might say, well, the obvious thing here is that there's no equipment, there's no nurses, there's no doctors. So we need to put all of those things in, and nursing and neonatal care will get better. And in simplest form, you're not wrong if you think that way. If you put more doctors and more nurses into a low or middle income country, you will make things better. But we don't need to do new research to show that, because actually there are many research projects in the developing world which show exactly that. The problem comes in that all of those things cost money. And at the moment, there is no money, and things are getting worse with COVID, in fact, in the developing world. And so the real key is making gains with what you have. And so this led us to try and explore this problem a little bit more. We the most important thing, going back to that key question, is that I can have a question from what my appreciation is of a certain situation, but my appreciation coming into a developing world setting might not be the same appreciation of the team that's worked there day in, day out for the last 10, 15, 20 years. And so what we did was we had a unit meeting, and we talked to the whole team to try and understand whether other people were feeling the same way that I was. And in fact, the unit meeting was one of the most difficult meetings I've ever had in my life, but it was difficult not because people were disagreeing with me, but because it was like opening up the floodgates, where all of a sudden people were crying, people were expressing themselves, and able to express themselves in a way that they maybe hadn't before, about how difficult they found it working on a unit where patients were dying with such high frequency. We held a community meeting as well, where we discussed with the local communities that we served about the enormous cost, and the cost psychologically to losing a child, I think is huge, and is clearly something that's very difficult to write down and express in words. But as well as the psychological cost, there's a huge cost to the families, which was a double burden, because families not only were losing a child, but then going into debt in order to bury their child. And this was having a knock-on effect for the healthcare for the rest of the family unit, and indeed the community as a whole. And I think that when you put that into context, what I regret at this stage was that I didn't take it further than this local team. And if I were to do it again, I would have then gone to the central referral hospital, which was Malago at the time, and I would have tried to involve them in a bigger way in what we were planning to do. And I've put this in just to show that even in a project that's gone very well, you can still learn from it, and change what you would do the next time round. So after we realised that we all felt the same way, we wanted to know, well, had someone else already looked at this? Had they done this project before? Were there lessons that we could just put in place in order to make things better? And what we discovered from the literature search was that there wasn't any current research. And in fact, the majority of interventions in low and middle income countries looking at neonatal mortality were based in the community, and that was surrounding providing traditional birth attendance or encouraging people to attend antenatal classes. There was one study in Ethiopia where mortality was improved in the pediatric ward, but once the American doctors left, when they went back 2 years later, the mortality rate had slipped back to where it had started from. And I think this highlighted to us that this was a problem that lots of people recognized was a problem, but no one had come up with a good, sustainable solution to fix it. And so this meant that we had to start from scratch. And the first discussion was, where do you think we are going wrong? What do you think we are doing, or what do you think we are not doing on the neonatal unit here, which is leading to all of these babies passing away? And actually that discussion was hugely helpful. It was a discussion with the clinical team, it was discussion with parents. And one thing that I'm looking back on it was one of the turning points was one of our nurses had a baby who'd unfortunately passed away on our neonatal unit. And her insights into the care and what had happened on the neonatal unit were absolutely vital to our plan going forward. And what we did was, once we got past all of the things that we all accepted were problems, but we couldn't fix, like the staffing levels, like the equipment levels, etc., we dialed it down to the things that we thought were modifiable in the neonatal unit that might make a difference to mortality. And we put it down to infection control and sepsis. And this was because we didn't have ventilators to ventilate tiny premature babies, and we thought that a lot of babies died who were febrile, who had infections, and even our premature babies were dying with infections, and this was something that we should look at in more detail. And the third thing, sorry, that we looked at was the provision of fluids and nutrition to our patient population. And this was because the terminal event for most of our babies was aspiration. And these were sick term or preterm babies. And when you went to resuscitate them when they stopped breathing, you would generally find milk in the oropharynx, or they just vomited. And this was something that we wanted to address. And so we came up with our research question, and our research question was, could we sustainably reduce the neonatal mortality in a rural hospital in Uganda by implementing guidelines from an evidence base that were adapted for a rural hospital setting? And we found that this question was something that resonated with parents, it resonated with the nurses who worked on the unit, it resonated with the community as well. And we thought that it would probably resonate to others who were working in similar settings, given that there is no research on this currently. And just to give you a flavour of what we did, we changed our admission policy to make sure that all sick babies were cared for on the neonatal unit, rather than some of them being cared for on the labour ward, some of them being cared for on the surgical ward if they had a surgical problem, or on the paediatric ward if they might have come in from home. We acknowledged that going from patient to patient, when there aren't as many hand washing facilities as we have here, that having the observation done by parents rather than by the neonatal nurses might reduce the level of cross-infection. And then to add to that, we separated the premature babies from the septic babies. You can see in this picture there are 3 premature babies all on the same baby warmer. And also we gave much more power to the nursing staff to enforce strict hand washing and also shoe removal, which is important in the developing world because there are mostly dirt roads, and that means a lot of soil and things making their way onto the neonatal unit if they don't remove their shoes. Looking at sepsis, we identified the risk factors for sepsis, and we used data that we still use now in this country. I know that the Kaiser Permanente sepsis calculator is an interesting discussion point at the moment, but we use the traditional risk factors of maternal fever, chorioamnionitis, and things like that, to try and predict babies who might need early treatment. And we instigated that treatment early. And we accepted that we were probably going to deliver antibiotics to babies who didn't need them. But we countered that with the fact that if we missed sepsis, there was no backup. If a baby became apneic because of sepsis, then the baby would die, because we had no ventilators in order to provide ongoing respiratory support. And so our absolute priority was to stop babies from becoming apneic. We used evidence from Malago, which was the National Referral Hospital, and also Kenya as well, that described the common pathogens that were present in the countries, and we made clear indications as to when to start and then when to escalate antibiotic care. And we had 3 very clear antibiotic regimens depending on what level of escalation that the baby was on. And we defined the length of treatment, and this goes back to doing a proper literature search, because actually we all are used to doing 5 days of antibiotics for an infection, and there was a general feeling that there was no evidence for this, but actually, looking back, there is. But we also audited our antibiotic policy as part of this, and found that if we gave babies 4 days of antibiotics, they had a 50% chance of coming back to the unit with infection. If we gave them 5 days of antibiotics, they had a 2% chance of coming back. And we thought, oh, wonderful, look at this great evidence that we found. And then we discovered that in the 1960s, someone has already done this project, and that's where our treatment lengths come from, is evidence done from the 60s. We also provided a lot of education to parents about what to look out for and when to bring it up. Our fluids and nutrition, we focused on this terminal event, which was aspiration, and we decided not to feed unwell babies. And we came up with this mantra of stop the feeds and start IV fluids. This was repeated again and again and again on bedside teaching, ward rounds, in unit meetings. And this, if I was to pick one of these interventions that made the biggest difference, this was definitely the one. We went from seeing almost all of our babies dying from aspiration to no babies dying from aspiration almost overnight when we introduced this guideline. We tried to reduce the workload for our one nurse by making an intravenous fluid solution that might not have been the most perfect, but it did the job, and it meant that the time taken to prepare the dextrose solution was a lot shorter than trying to mix from 3 different bottles and trying to track down a bottle size that was the right size, and all the infection risks that might entail. And we also we leaned on the WHO guidance for breast milk alternatives, which was a really important step, because the reason why many of the babies come to the neonatal unit is because the mothers are so unwell. And there's no safe storage of express milk, there's no formula that's available for a multitude of reasons, and even if it was in the supermarkets, it was completely unaffordable, and would have bankrupted even, people, expatriate people living there with big incomes couldn't afford to buy the formula. And so we used the WHO recommended breast milk alternatives as a bridge whilst mothers recovered and were able to try and start expressing again. So we're coming on to another key point, which is the ethics of doing studies abroad. And I would say that actually the ethics of a research question is universal. But I think it takes on special meaning when you are planning a research intervention in the developing world, given Africa in particular, but across the developing world, the very difficult history that there has been, where people have been less responsible and done studies that maybe aren't quite so ethically justifiable going forward. And so we discussed our study at the ethical board within the hospital as a first step, and we decided that we didn't need to go further, because actually we weren't trying new or experimental treatment as such. The current practice on the neonatal unit wasn't evidence-based, and in fact had no basis in good clinical care. But also that we weren't going to be incurring a cost to the family or to the hospital, and we didn't need to apply for grants or further money. And actually what we were doing by introducing these guidelines was reducing the workload on the clinical staff. And then hand in hand with the ethics and the question comes the acceptability of the intervention. You have to make sure that people are going to buy into your intervention. Otherwise, at best, they will do it, or people will do it while you are there watching them. And the minute you step away, the care will go back to the way it was. But also, if people aren't agreeing with it, then there are some exceptional circumstances where you are doing something that people feel might not be the best way forward. But if that's the case, then you certainly need to have a more robust ethical approach to ensure that your research project is acceptable to the wider community, if not the specific community that you're treating. Before you start any research project, it's very important to define how you're going to measure your success or failure. And for us, we decided that what we were interested in was mortality rate. This was the only thing that the parents were interested in. They didn't care in the meetings how long they stayed in hospital. They purely cared about whether their baby came home alive or dead. And I think that this was something that took me a little bit by surprise, because length of stay is so important to us here in the UK, and it highlighted to me the importance of keeping parents in the loop when planning the question. We also wanted to make sure that it was sustainable, and so we wanted to make sure that we repeated these assessments up to 5 years after the intervention. And just to emphasize that, this is the last of the key points for design, which is to make sure your outcomes are meaningful. Meaningful outcomes are important to engaging your population, but also not getting it right risks turning people away from research. And so the next person who comes in with a good idea will find it harder to perform a research project if they've had 50 people coming in to do something that the unit and the parents don't believe in. So we made our guidelines, we implemented them overnight, all those things that we're told not to do, and ideally you wouldn't do. We had a series of bedside teaching, community meetings. We had at-a-glance posters fixed to the wall of the neonatal unit. And I think I show this slide because they're the results, and I feel that you shouldn't talk about research without talking a little bit about results. And I've put the dreaded P number in here because unfortunately it's very difficult to get papers published unless you describe your results in statistical detail, even if you're describing negative results. But you can see just from the deaths per 3 months, which is the third row along, that we went from 79 deaths in 3 months pre-intervention to 40 deaths post-intervention. And actually, that doesn't tell really the story, because most of those deaths that happened post-intervention came about because the Ugandan national television caught wind of what was happening at Kigando, came and started recording just as we were resuscitating a tiny premature baby, which was a successful resuscitation. The baby survived that, and when that's hit the national TV, we suddenly started getting referrals from hours and hours away, where babies were coming, tiny 1 kilo babies were coming by bus from Kampala to receive neonatal care, and obviously that led to an increase in mortality in our unit. However, even with this, our admissions have continued to increase over the 5 years, and our mortality rate is the same, even getting better 5 years post-intervention. And this means it wasn't my presence in the neonatal unit that made the mortality rate drop. It was the nursing staff and medical doctors who are working within the unit with those guidelines that have reduced the mortality rate and kept that mortality rate sustainably reduced going forward in a way that transcends one person arriving and doing a year's worth of work. So what did we do with the results? Well, actually, the most important thing that we did was we shared the results with the community. And these pictures are pictures of people who have graduated from our neonatal unit. And the small picture down in the bottom left are babies born at 1 kilo or less, who came back to the unit. And we continue to see them because I still go back and forward. to see these kids, and they are outstanding individuals cared for by the nursing team. And actually, this wonderful sharing and celebration is what made the year of hard work all worthwhile, because this is just when you see results like this, and when you see that it's had such an impact on the community, it's such a springboard for other things to improve, that this has probably been one of the best things that we've ever done. That meeting where we shared the results with the community, no conference or publication will ever match that meeting. That said, we have had a number of publications out of this single project. There are other projects as well, and we continue to publish the results of care advances, although I'm very pleased to report that most often now I am not the first author, because other Ugandans and also British medical students, American medical students are going over and reporting the great work that's happening in the neonatal unit. But these things are very helpful for you when you try and plan the next project, and also through your career. I have talked about working in Uganda in my medical school, in my JHO interview, my ST1 interview, my grid interview, and at my consultant interview as well. So these things have made it into every aspect of my current career as well. And a little bit about that wider change, the morale of the unit, it went from somewhere that people worked because nobody wanted them elsewhere, to the place that everybody wanted to work. And what it showed us was that if you improve the confidence and the morale of the unit, then the standard of care goes up just by that alone. And so the standard of care across the hospital improved because of this project. Nurses were more confident, the hospital was more confident in offering obstetric care to their obstetric patients. It received national interest in terms of radio and also TV, and what it's led to, and these nice pictures of us standing in a nice neonatal unit, is because we then got large sums of money in order to build a new neonatal unit. And this has certainly helped us to probably lead to that further drop in neonatal mortality that we saw in our results. And most importantly, people come to the hospital expecting their baby to survive, and that expectation of care has led to a much bigger improvement. And just to show you, this is the new neonatal unit, which in many respects looks like what we're used to in the UK, but also we've developed this service to include paediatric intensive care as well. And so those babies that just needed a few hours, or those children that just need a few hours of ventilation while antibiotics kick in or a blood transfusion takes place if they've got severe malaria, these things can now be done when we're making other inroads into paediatric care as well. And even the elephants are having babies. Alongside our improvement in the neonatal world, we border a national park, and I'm pleased to report that the elephant population is increasing there as well. So just to sum up, what lessons did I learn? Well, I learned that if I wanted to change something, I had to make sure that others feel the same way. And if you make sure that that's the case, then planning your intervention becomes so much easier, because the breadth of knowledge that you can draw on to make a research project in the developing world is huge. And if you're planning your intervention and everyone's chipping in, it's very easy to make a very robust research project. And it's also very easy to plan how you're going to evaluate the intervention so that you can show that it works, but also so that you can keep engaging the people involved in the research as well. One thing that I learned, mainly from the 10 years prior to my research project, is that it is incredibly difficult to do research or to go into a situation like a low income setting and say, this is how you do it, to a bunch of people who have worked in that setting for the last 10 years, who don't know you, and particularly when you have no experience of working in the developing world. I am asked to go and talk to other countries and other hospitals in similar settings, and I would say the biggest the biggest challenge that we have to overcome is helping people to trust you and trust us as a team. And we spend the majority of our time when we're talking to other hospitals trying to understand what they feel the problem is and what problems they've come up with before we even start about talking about interventions and things like that. Help is essential. You can never do this on your own, and I would argue that when you are stuck on your own, your project is going to suffer, even if it's well planned and well thought out. But I think that the planning and execution stages of your project are going to be that much harder. And it's important to share your results, even if there's no benefit, because if you don't share the negative results, then it risks people doing the same things over and over. So a little slide just to say, if you are interested in research, particularly research in the developing world, contact the people who have done research in that area. Now, we can give you contacts for people who do research in the UK, who have research arms in Africa, for example. I know that Kelly Tan from UCLH does a lot of research in Kampala, and people like Kelly would be absolutely delighted to meet with you and talk to you about how you're doing it, but also talk to people who work in the areas. Most of these research departments, most of these central hospitals have got people who would be very keen to talk to you about how you could be involved in research. And remember, it's never too late to start your research career. So I'll end there. I'm very happy to answer any questions. I know that it's very difficult to ask questions and to have interactive sessions when it's online like this, but if you don't put them in the chat box now, or if you're watching this back in the future, feel free to drop me an email or DM me on Twitter, and I'll gladly signpost you to people who could help. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for such an interesting talk. What a story. A question from me would be, obviously a lot of what you were doing was kind of on that quality improvement model of what can we do to improve care and what can we do to decrease the mortality rate. And I think a lot of trainees will be familiar with doing a quality improvement project, maybe collect a little bit of data along the way, but obviously you managed to think about this in quite a structured way and collect the necessary data to then have something that you could statistically analyze and have something that you could publish. And what do you think, taking that kind of research minded approach to what you were doing with the changes in care, affected that project, as opposed to just saying, oh, you know what, we're getting a lot of babies who are aspirating, so let's stop feeding them? What do you think was added to that by saying, oh, and you know what, we're going to record this data, we're going to make the intervention at a specific time, kind of being a bit more regimented about it?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's one that comes up not infrequently, actually, and it comes to this separation of quality improvement versus research. And the difference between a quality improvement project and research is that with a quality improvement model, you are taking something that someone has already proven to work, measuring what you do against that known known practice, and then improving your adherence to that known practice. So a great example of quality improvement is looking at thermoregulation for neonates. Sorry, I'm going to use loads of neonatal examples, but a lot of people, particularly with the RCPCH, have done thermoregulation projects where they've gone to check to see what they can do to improve the thermoregulation of patients from labour ward to the neonatal unit. And that's based on the fact that there is a plethora of research that shows that if your baby drops its temperature, then it's more likely to die. And so that's quality improvement. The reason why this is research rather than quality improvement is that there are no guidelines like the ones that we're introducing that had been proven to work. And so we had to create our own guidelines based around 3 areas which we aim to reduce mortality. And so that the reason why you have to robustly ensure that those guidelines worked using data collection and statistics is because whilst the chances were low, and we had checked that with the ethical board and outside experts, etc., there was always a chance that our intervention would make things worse. And we felt very keenly responsible to ensure that we did no harm, and certainly if we had been doing harm, to stop the intervention and revert back to what we were doing before. And so this way of collecting data to prove that our intervention works, what that has led to is the ability to then do quality improvement projects in our hospital, but also in other hospitals around, where we use these guidelines now as the standard by which to measure practice, and then investigate quality improvement projects in order to improve adherence to a known successful way of doing things. And so your data collection and your rigid way of thinking allows you to ensure that your intervention works when you don't have the proof to say that, for example, stopping feeds reduces mortality, early antibiotics reduces mortality. There's no evidence in the developing world that putting all of these things together would have made a difference. And in fact, there was always a suggestion. One of the discussions we had was whether the early use of antibiotics might lead to antimicrobial resistance. And in fact, it hasn't done in the hospital. And these are things that you need research to prove rather than quality improvement. I think that's answered the question, but it might not have done.
No, that definitely did. Thank you for that. Any other questions, either in the chat box or pop your mics on?
Maybe we draw it to a close there, and do please drop me an email or send me a tweet, or drop by Kings. We can have a chat about this in more detail if anyone's got any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for that really fascinating talk, Chris. I am also just going to pop that feedback link into the chat box again, so please do give us a bit of feedback on today's session. And thanks everyone for coming, and thanks again to Chris. Really, really interesting talk.
Thank you very much. Take care.